Be nice. Yeah. But it didn't happen, unfortunately. So, yep, I'm heading that direction. We'll see as we go along. So Abraham went as he was asked, and he left. Also, God talks to him when he's 75 years old and tells him to do what? Tells him to move again. So where does he go? He's got to cross rivers again, so we'll just assume there's bridges. And he comes and he goes around here. He comes down and he goes to places like Hebron. That's Jerusalem, Hebron, Kadesh Barnea, Beersheba. So why are they doing this? There's a big desert here. It's called the Negev. It's the word for south, for desert, everything. So most of the time you can't just go, oh, I'll go across. It just doesn't work. If you lived in Sydney, you'll know you can't just go across. We're pretty good here in Victoria. It was set out by Latrobe. He liked his grid pattern, and so we can get from one side of Melbourne to the other easy. It doesn't happen everywhere in the world. So we've got Abraham doing it now. Just to give you an idea of what's going on, because it's easy to say, yep, he did that. But to go from up to Haran, it's 3,415 kilometres approximately. And then to go from Haran down to Hebron, another 726. Still doesn't mean anything, I suspect, to you, and it didn't to me. So I got the atlases out and I got my string and I measured it up and I checked other ways as well. So going from to Haran, if you can imagine going from call it Brisbane, and you walk all the way to Melbourne. How does it feel? Footsore? So, from up to Haran, Abraham walks with his family, with his sheep, his goats, his camels, whatever, and all his servants. They walk from Melbourne to Brisbane. From Brisbane to Melbourne. They spend some time here, then God says, right, I want you to come down here, and he goes to Hebron. You can see he's gone almost 2/3 of the way. Now, he's gone from Brisbane to Melbourne, now he gets told to go to Adelaide. And he has to walk to Adelaide. Something you'd like to do? If God said to you, right, I want you to up and leave your families and take all your household goods, wheelbarrow them, and start walking and go all that way. I agree. I'm not quite there, 75, but they were a lot younger than us in their bodies, thankfully. So it's a long way that he walked. Very interesting for me from a point of view. But now I hope you can see why I've done this. So it just gives you an idea of how far. If we set out from, and we know that some people have walked from Melbourne to Sydney or whatever, and others have cycled around Australia, but they're not us, are they? We don't have that driving force. So, okay, Abraham, he's been doing this. Wars are happening around here all the time. But we're going to go to Monday. Monday is the temptation of Egypt. So he gets to here, roughly around, I can't think of the word now. Anyway, Hebron. And what happens when he gets there? Genesis 12 and verse 10. There's a famine. And these things do happen in the world. And when you're living in a tent and travelling and you need food for your animals. So what does Abraham decide to do? Okay, verse 10. And there was famine in the land, and Abraham went down into Egypt and sojourned there, for the famine was grievous or bad in the land. So he gets to here, and now he's got to walk to here. Yes, I've worked that one out too. You're in Melbourne, and someone says, oh, it's not too good down here in Melbourne. You ought to walk up to Albury. Off you go, walk to Albury. They've got some good food up there on the Maree. There's plenty of water there. Off you go with your cattle, your tents, everybody. Walk your sheep, walk your kids. and walk from Melbourne to Albury. Getting tired? I don't know how they did it, to be honest. Long walk. So they walk there. And what happens when he gets to Egypt? We'll get to that in a minute. But Abraham goes there. Notice that when we read through that chapter, there's no record of Abraham being told to go to Egypt, and there's no reference to him actually asking God, what should I do? Because he seemed to have a better phone line to God than we do, so you'd expect that to happen. But it didn't. He gets to Egypt and he starts telling lies. Half lies, white truths, whatever you want to call them, but they're lies, and gets into a real pickle. So...
Yes, at that point, we realize that God does not expect us to be perfect. Because when we refer to the story of Abraham, and we even look at his offspring like David, they were not perfect, but God still calls him the father of faith.
So I wouldn't say that God...
He has completely ignored God, that gave him instructions, and now he decides, I'll take a path to find solutions for myself.
Yes.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that God doesn't want us to be perfect. He knows we can't be perfect.
Yes.
That's the difference. And he thankfully winks at the mistakes we make, so long as we really do love him and head in the right direction, you could say. So he goes to Egypt, and there's problems in Egypt. Let's see what the Bible has to say about Egypt. So turn to 2 Kings chapter 18. And Bob's given us all some nice bookmarks. We'll keep the bookmark in Genesis while we come across here. So 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 21. And here's an interesting comment. And I'll read it from the NIV. Now look, you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff which pierces a man's hand and wounds him if he leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. So thankfully at some stage the Israelites did recognise the problem and God did warn them. Did Abraham have a good time there? Not really. He ended up in trouble. And as Erastus was saying, if you have a look on Monday's lesson, down the bottom, mine's in a green section at the bottom, just the paragraph above it, it says, what we see here then is that how even a great man of God can make a mistake and not be forsaken by God. When the New Testament talks about Abraham as an example of salvation by grace, it means just that, grace. Because if it weren't by grace, Abraham, like all of us, would have no hope. It's quite true. We can't earn our way to heaven. We always mess it up. They also ask us to compare Pharaoh's behaviour with Abraham. So we'll go back to Genesis chapter 12 and verses 18 to 20. And if you had a look through there, what sort of behaviour do we see in Pharaoh here? Okay, verse 18. So, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I could take her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abraham to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. What could Pharaoh have done?
Abraham was afraid that his wife was, in fact, his cousin.
No, but what could Pharaoh?
Was very beautiful and would have been taken from him and him killed.
But we're looking at Pharaoh's personality, his behaviour. What could Pharaoh have done under this circumstance when he found out things were bad?
Well, they would have also sought to punish him.
Yeah, because he was a leader. He was used to punishing people, wasn't he? Yeah. So Pharaoh could have punished him, but did he?
He didn't.
He didn't. Why not?
Well, we now know that that was not his intention. He was somehow good-hearted too.
He was good-hearted, yes. We could say he was good-natured, honourable, generous, all those nice things. But what had happened? God was looking after Abraham. Yes, Pharaoh had a dream.
But Pharaoh had a vision. God had given him a vision.
Ah, yes. God gave him the vision and he knew it was from God. Yes. So I see God intervening here for Abraham's benefit. He'd made a mistake. Have we been in that situation? We've made a mistake. But I sort of get this picture of some child being pulled up by they say the bootstraps. They used to wear braces in those days. In the old cartoons used to have the parent holding onto the braces and the kid's legs dangling and being rescued from some disaster. I can see God doing pretty much that with us too. So yes, I've got a feeling that God rescued him because Pharaoh had a dream. So it was more likely due to God's intervention that Pharaoh sent Abraham on his way. It appears that Pharaoh was more generous and more righteous and honourable and all the rest of it. But if you know history and archaeology, you know that's probably not the case. Was Pharaoh a good man? He may have had his moments, but God intervened despite Abraham's bad behaviour. What did Abraham then have to do? So he's come from around here, come across, he's come there. Now what does he have to do? All the way back again. But there's a famine. There's no mention the famine stopped. So what's he done? Wasted his time, his effort. He's walked from Melbourne to Albury. He gets there and finds it's no good and he has to walk all the way back to Melbourne again. Yeah, great fun. So it wasn't a day's walk.
It took very long because you're moving not just one person, a whole group of people, a big herd of animals and all that they own.
That's right. I have walked the distance of Preston to the city. It takes quite a few hours. Not something I ever want to do again, but we happily do it if you're interested in trekking or climbing rocks and mountains and things. People do it all the time. Yes, my daughter, she loves going out all those places.
I'm not as sympathetic as you, folks,
No?
on this walking thing. That was part of their lives, wasn't it?
It was part of their life.
And so moving from one spot to another, it's just a matter of, okay, pack up, let's go, and whatever.
But it wasn't easy. Now,
It wasn't easy.
when I started school at 5 years of age, I had to walk a K to school. And on the way in wintertime, I'd jump in the paddles and break the ice. That K walk, well, it was more than a K, it was a mile, so it was 1.6 Ks. I did that to school and then I did it return home. And now, if you have to walk that far to do anything, it's terrible. My mum walked that far every week to do the shopping. My brother was in the pram, I was on a log of wood on the seat, and all the goodies were packed around us, and we went all the way to the shopping and all the way back because that was the closest shop. I agree, Bob, we were used to it. We were a bit tougher in those days, weren't we? I know, we could say the young people are soft, but it doesn't. Things change, and they have other things to do as well. Okay, so we've moved on to Genesis on Tuesday, and we're in Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 to 18. And now we've got Abraham and Lot. And what sort of character has Abraham got here? Because they're back in the land, back to where they started from. There's still the famine, but there's fighting between Abraham and Lot's families and herds. Remember, there's not a lot of grass when it comes to famine time. And Abraham decides that it's time to separate. So what does Abraham say to Lot? I'm the eldest, I'm the most important, God's given me the vision, so this is where I'm going to go. And you can have what's left. Is that what Abraham said? You're all shaking your head. I can't hear a loud no. What did Abraham say? You can choose. You can go first. Okay? So Abraham here, we're seeing some of the good sides of his character. He had some good sides and some not so good. He had some strength of character. He also had some weakness. Why am I bringing that out? Because there's things in our character we don't tell anybody about, but we're not proud of. So he's human, we're human. God loved him. Does God love us? Yes, very much so. So,
When Abraham was moving to Egypt, he
yes,
was worried about his security,
yes,
pasture for his animals.
yes,
But now comes a point where Lot wants to walk away and he gives him the freedom to take the choicest part of the land. What happened?
yes, what happened? So let's go back to our map. This little area here is the Jordan Valley. You've got the Sea of Galilee and you've got the Dead Sea. That distance there is 106 kilometres. Now, Abraham said, if you go to the right, I'll go to the left, or vice versa. What did Lot say? Oh, I'll go north or I'll go south. What did he say? Okay, verse 11 in chapter 13. Then Lot chose him how much of the plain? All the plain. Now, there's a river, Jordan, that runs here. Lot chose all of that area, the whole lot. He was offered north or south, but he just said, no, I want the whole lot. Now, for those who are interested in geography, that's what's called a rift valley. It goes down into Egypt, it goes all the way down here. Fantastic photos if you ever look up the Rift Valley on Google or something like that. And it's just like you've got a giant sugar scoop and it just goes straight down and flat. And it goes all the way up here. So the mountains run this way. And if you're from Lebanon, you'll know that the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains are there and that river there. So what was left for Abraham? The hill country, they call it. Bit barren, bit dry. Sometimes we find ourselves in the hill country. Because I'm going to ask an obvious question. Do we miss out on things as Christians? We do. Oh, you're a Christian, you don't deserve it. Oh, you're a Christian, we're not going to let you have it, is the attitude to many people. And they do. They cut us out, they stop us getting good jobs, they stop us doing this, that and the other thing. But what does God give us? It's something they don't have. What did God say? I'm your little shield? Oh dear, only a little shield? No. When Abraham was told to leave Pharaoh and Egypt, he went, it says, with everything he had. Pharaoh could have confiscated the lot and said, get lost. But he was sent out with everything he had. God protected him. We have God's protection. We have God's love. And what does he offer us at the end?
The other thing we've not talked about is that...
Oh, no, wait a minute. We'll just finish the story. What does God offer us at the end of our journey? Eternal life. All right? That's the most important thing. If we miss out here, God still protects us here, but we are offered eternal life. Now, Erastus, what did you want to say?
Now, look at that massive movement. What we have not talked about is that there were small kingdoms all over the place. Even though the earth was not as densely populated as it is now, no kingdom would allow any other people to move across their territory. There was like, they were resisting that movement and they would fight you all the time. And we see Abraham moving all over the place.
Yes.
And even when Lot chooses to withdraw from Abraham, he was still going to go close to people who are not going to be very inviting.
Yes. So you can see if you stand, like you say, if you stand back, you can see it's not possible for Abraham to have done all this travelling successfully and safely with everything intact. After all, robbers pick off a few sheep, a few goats from the outside of the herd when you're not watching at night time, whatever. But that didn't seem to happen. So yes, there is protection all the way, even though he made mistakes. Right. So this is an occasion where God, for the fourth time, addresses Abraham. And God speaks to Abraham, and this is what we saw earlier on. And chapter 13, verse 14. And the Lord said unto Abraham, after that Lot was separated from him, Do what? Verse 14.
Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south and east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring.
So what is God saying to Abraham? Lot's chosen the best, but
I will protect you, I will provide for you.
I'll protect you, provide for you. And someone else said,
All this is yours.
all this is yours, despite what everyone's saying. So over the centuries, millennia, everyone said, this is our land, this belongs to us, we can do what we want, we've got these gods protecting us. God's always said, no, it's my land, and one day I'm coming back to do what? To reclaim it, take it up. I thought about that for a little bit, but anyway, we'll go on. So Abraham gets reassurance that God would put it right, and he's told to walk over the land, not run. When you're young, you run everywhere. I was waiting in the airport not so many hours ago, and there was a family trying to kill time, and there was 2 children, roughly around the ages of 6 and 8. And at night time, the airport's pretty deserted, and the kids were running up the great areas and then skidding back because it's a shiny floor, having great fun. And I could see the parents saying, keep going, wear out that energy. And yep, but the parents walk. Do we learn to walk as we get older? I'm talking religiously. Do we learn that we can't race ahead of God? We can't always have what we want. We need to walk. And I found that personally. There's things that I'd love to have done earlier. Probably never do them now. But God says it's okay. I've given you all the other opportunities. You've enjoyed them. Just keep walking. Yep, Bob, we can keep walking because God's with us, gives us the energy. Wednesday, the coalition of the Babel coalition. Okay, why is it Babel? Because Babylon. Now remember, this is all desert. At the moment, people race across it in Toyotas with guns attached to it. But in those days, they didn't have Toyotas, they couldn't do it. So the coalition comes from this area. Now this area here, following the Euphrates, is known as Mesopotamia, all right, or Babylonia. Yes, there was lots of little kingdoms and they changed and swapped around and grew big and decreased. But basically that area is called Babylon. And now we're going to look at 5 kings whose names I won't try and pronounce. Sorry, 4 kings. 4 kings came from here and they came up and they attacked. Why did they come and attack this area? What had the people around here stopped doing? Thank you, paying taxes. Does the tax man come after you if you stop paying taxes? Yes. So these 5 kings came. Now we've looked at how far they had to walk. They had to walk from Melbourne to Brisbane, to Melbourne and then to Adelaide. Could you go and fight a war after you've walked all that distance? Would you really be fighting fit? But they came down here and 5 kings from round here tried to fight them. Did they succeed with this tired army? No, they lost. Lost badly. What happened to Lot and his wonderful dream of having a great time?
Taken captive.
He was taken captive. Okay. So a little bit more geography for you. So they came down and they followed the same route and then they came down this way. Went round here and back up. And they got here and they stopped. You might remember, those who weren't here at the beginning, this area here was controlled by Babylon and Cass. This area on this side of the mountains was controlled by Egypt and attacked. So if you've wondered why they came down here, those mountains divided and Egypt didn't really care about that, but Babylon did. And so it comes around here, and this area here roughly is where Sodom and Gomorrah are assumed to be. No one's been able to prove it, but it seems to match up properly. So they come here and they go back. Now where is Abraham's here? my dotting's not too good. So they come down here past, and they go back up there past Abraham. Why wasn't he paying tax? Interesting, isn't it? As I go through these, I start to try and think a little bit more laterally or differently. And why was Abraham left alone? Why were these areas taken? They get as far as Hobart up here. They go through Dan. And they say, oh, we've defeated everybody. That's great. We can slow down a bit. And after all of the walking and the fighting, I'm not surprised. But what happens? Somebody comes running down and comes to the area around Hebron and says to Abraham, oh, there's been a big war and your nephew's been taken captive. And so we're going to have a look now at what Abraham does. And that's on Wednesday in the Coalition, chapter 14. And there's an interesting question asked there. What's the significance of the war happening just after Abraham's been promised this area?
All he did was to remember that God had said and it would happen.
God,
So
yeah.
that would reassure him, that would give him the courage.
But why does Babylon come and decide to start fighting just after that promise?
Well, all the lands around Abraham, their allegiance were not to God and only Abraham.
But why just then? Who hates God's plans? Satan. Every time we set out to do something good, we slip up. Why? There's this little voice says, oh, you don't really need to do what God asked. Or just puts a little temptation in front of you. Before you know it, you're involved. Every time. Ever wonder why this is always a hotbed of strife? God says, in the new heavens and new earth, it's going to be where? The New Jerusalem. It's going to be my capital. It's going to be mine. Never stops. All sorts of interesting things can be said about the area, but God says it's going to be mine. Over the centuries, it hasn't always been under God's control, apparently, but then God did make some predictions about how long it was going to be under other control, so God says, yep, that's okay, I still know. So why did it happen just after God claims it again? It irritates. Ever had somebody you've had to work under? Every time you do something right, they get irritated that you've done something good because someone comes and says, oh, really, did you do that? Oh, that's great. In front of your boss. Yeah, great, fun. Oh, and the boss then gives you some nasty job to do. Doesn't always help. And then they also ask, what does it teach us about Abraham? So let's have a look and see what we see at the end of chapter 14. So chapter 14, around verse 22. But Abraham said to the king, oh, yeah, I'm probably just jumping a bit too far ahead. So that's all happened. Abraham then puts together his army. I'm not sure where I've lost that. You can't put together an army unless you have an army already trained. It's called the reserves in Australia, and there's lots of people who join the reserves with the knowledge that if there is a war, they have to go and fight. There's no ifs or buts. Abraham's slaves and household and retinue, workers, servants, were trained for war. And as Erastus pointed out, these lots of little kingdoms here. So you had to always be prepared for war. And we think, oh, Abraham's just sitting in his tent waiting for the angels to come and offer him some advice, whatever. No, these people in Abraham's household were trained for war constantly. So when this happens, Abraham says, right, 318 of us, let's go, and we'll capture. And so they go from here, which is the trees of Maree. The King James, they don't know why they translate it as the plain of Maree. It's actually the oak tree, the great oak trees of Maree, and it was known at the time, so people scratch their heads about that. So if you imagine great oak trees here that Abraham's resting under, and he goes up and he goes, and the army is sitting at Hobart resting. So Abraham, good general, goes in at night and he captures everything, and he chases them from Dan all the way to Hobart and keeps going a little bit. And he gets Lot back, and then, of course, offers everything to people. He comes back down again, and you notice he comes past Jerusalem on his way to Hebron. Relatively speaking, when you look at all this, Hebron and Jerusalem are not far apart. Who lived at Hebron? Sorry, it's who lived in Jerusalem, which was known as Salem at the time. It's Thursday's lesson. The king of Salem was? Melchizedek, yes. So Melchizedek's there. Is he a wonderful heathen worshipping the sun god? No. Who does he worship? The true God. So we've already got somebody in charge worshipping the true God, and Abraham has to come all that way and set up a kingdom. God doesn't give us any answers to why, but we know that we don't know anything about what happened after Melchizedek was king. Abraham knew about him, obviously, because when he comes back after defeating the coalition, he comes back and he offers what to Melchizedek? Tithes. Who do you give tithes to? Next door neighbour? No, why? Next door neighbour might really need it. They might be having a hard time.
We are not told how Abraham knew that Melchizedek was a priest.
He was a priest.
But somehow now we know that he knew Melchizedek was God's priest.
Yes, so he knew.
He goes to him because that is the point of intercession.
Yep. So he offers him the tithes and Melchizedek accepts it. Shows us that the tithing system existed before we actually read about it with the Exodus. It shows the priesthood existed before we read about it being set up for the Exodus. Yep, so it's interesting that there's unanswered questions here for us. But he comes back and he offers Melchizedek the tithes. And we know that Melchizedek's the worshipper of God, the true God, which shows that God's message was known. God was known to exist. Over the Chaldees, Haran, Hebron, Jerusalem as we know it now, knew of the one and only true God. What effect did that have on the people around those areas?
They get to recognize the power of the living God.
But did it change them? What happened to after the king of Sodom took back his goods and went back home to live? Did he change? He'd had close by the king of Salem and Abraham witnessing to the true God. There's times we get very tired sometimes being Christians and nothing ever seems to change. And you hear these wonderful mission stories of how someone's lived, for 5 years and converted a whole village, or they set up a new church and 200 people are worshipping. And you think, all my life and nobody's changed around me. No, it's not unusual because the choice belongs with the people, and there's plenty of evidence for people to know about God then as there is today. But still people don't do anything about it.
There is a term that is used most in the civilized world, the developed world, say our way of life. And this our way of life attitude captures also Christians in it, because there are certain things we don't want to change, even though they become a hindrance between us and God and what God wants us to do. So
Yes.
we just want to maintain our way of
Life, that's true. So where we can witness all we like, we can witness quietly, we can witness loudly, but it's always up to the other people to make a choice, the same as it's up to us to continue making choices for God in our lives. That doesn't change. It's interesting also, it's here we learn that Abraham just didn't hop on his donkey or put on his sandals and go marching off to war, because he said that he wouldn't take all of those things that belong to other people. And what reason did he actually give? I just can't find it quickly, I'm afraid. When you're up here, it's not as easy to do as you might think. He said he'd made a previous agreement with God and had asked God to give him the victory. And as I said, those kids had come all that way, and if you'd walked from Brisbane all the way to Melbourne and then to Adelaide, and then had to fight a war, you'd be pretty footsore and tired. But they still beat the kings from there. So they were a fairly strong group of people. Then they'd come up further and they were resting, recuperating. Abraham was under no illusions that 318 men of his could defeat an army that was as strong as that. He asked God first, and he promised God, made an oath that he wouldn't take any spoil. The reason he made the promise is quite interesting. He said that he didn't want people to say his riches came from a worldly king, but from the King of the universe, who he knew was the most powerful king of all. He didn't want them to say, we made you rich. When someone says, we've done this for you, what usually comes back? We need you at some stage to reciprocate and do something for us. Is that how God works? I've saved you, so you have to obey my laws? What does John say? The beloved, the disciple who loved God. If you love me, keep my commandments, and my commandments are not burdensome. Is it burdensome not to steal from somebody? No? Okay. Is it burdensome to worship another God? It actually is. It is, because if you look at the people around you who worship other gods, they struggle in life and for happiness and contentment. So yes, it is. God's laws are kind. In my family history, my grandmother came from the Western District, where you didn't lock your door. The front and back doors were open, and you could walk in and you could make yourself a cup of tea if you wanted to, and have that, wash your dishes and leave again. And you'd tell her later, oh, well, we thank you very much. There was no issue. That was how it worked. When I went up there in my early 20s, they had their own petrol pumps by this stage, because I was actually on the graft horse that used to plough the field. But by this stage, they'd moved on to petrol. They had to put a padlock on their petrol pump because people were driving up into the farm and filling up their tank and driving away. Things had changed. So when there's no theft, when there's no covetousness, none of that, life is so much better. So that's what God says. My rules aren't hard. They're hard because we get tempted by that beautiful fruit hanging from the tree, which is rather sad, but we all do it. None of us are perfect, and as you said, God still loves us, thankfully, and he guides us. He calls us his children. Were your children always good, well-behaved, perfect kids? And if you say yes, I'll say I don't believe you. Were you always well-behaved as a child? I'm sure you've got memories of things you did that weren't the best. Do your parents love you? If they were decent parents, they did. What did they say? Just don't do it again, please. And sometimes they might say, oh, you're really giving me a bad reputation. And that's something that's very important in some cultures, is the reputation. They'll kill you if you mess their reputation. Does God do that? No, he doesn't. He just says, please don't do it again. I'll give you in a better way. Did Abraham change? I'm sure the Sabbath School lessons later coming up will tell us Abraham did change. He still was generous. He was still kind. But he toughened up a bit and he started to do what was right. And he trusted God to do what was right. And he could have trusted God with Sarah to keep her safe. Boy, she must have been stunningly beautiful. She was in her 80s, older than most of us here, and yet the Pharaoh thought she was so good he could take her as a wife. I could understand the wobbly knees when you come up against somebody rather strong and powerful. Doesn't mean we can be arrogant, but it does mean we can trust God. Right, I'll leave it there. Someone else? Yes?
Just as you close, there is a small quote about Abraham in The Heavenly Places by Ellen G. White.
Mm-hmm.
Says, the first that obeyed, he forsook his country, his home, his relatives, and all pleasant associations connected with his early life, to become a pilgrim and a stranger. Abraham might have reasoned with God and questioned the purpose of God in all this, but he showed that he had perfect confidence that God was leading him. He did not question whether it was being taken
Yes.
All we need to do is obey.
Obey. Obey, what does that word really mean? Listen with understanding and then do what God asks. That's what's important. And sometimes God asks us just to stay put, just to quietly. And there's millions of people who've lived through life and we don't know anything about them. But we'll meet them in heaven and we'll find out some interesting stories. Yes, first of all, we're going to have the mission story. So Hiskia, if you could play the mission story for us.
Jose's mother noticed that as a baby, her son didn't respond to sounds in their home in Mexico. She would call his name, and he wouldn't notice. When Jose was about 2 years old, his mother sought help. She sent him to a school to learn sign language and how to speak. His teacher taught him the sounds of letters and words. He put his hand to her throat when she spoke, and then tried to replicate the sound with his own throat. His mother cried because her son couldn't hear her voice. "Don't worry," the teacher said. "Have patience. Everything will work out fine." Each day, Jose went to the sign language school for 2 hours before going to an Adventist school for another 2 hours. The church school taught him how to read and write, but most importantly, it taught him about God. He attended this school up to the age of 8. Since the school didn't have teachers who knew sign language, Jose's mother ended up sending him to a public school with teachers who could communicate with him. The first time that Jose met other Adventists with hearing impairments was at a church-organized conference at Linda Vista Adventist University. It was wonderful to mingle with other Adventist young people with the same needs. Not long after, the Inter-American Division organized its first special needs conference and held the event at Montemorelos University in Monterrey, Mexico. At the conference, a desire grew in Jose to serve God as a pastor. But how? He could never afford the tuition. As the conference concluded, the university president made a surprising announcement. "Do any of you want to study here?" he asked. He offered a full scholarship for the tuition. Jose understood then that God was calling him to be a pastor, and he stood up. Jose is the first deaf theology student at Montemorelos University. It's difficult because almost no one else knows sign language. He concentrates hard and tries to read the teacher's lips. In his first year, he failed several classes, but pressed on, knowing that God had big plans for him. He has led several evangelistic meetings for the hearing impaired, including one in Mexico City. Several churches with deaf people have invited him to preach. Jose has a desire in his heart to serve as a pastor. He dreams about going to the mission field one day, ministering to the hearing impaired. Please pray for the students like Jose who are willing to do big things for the Lord. Thank you for supporting mission.
Ask the deacons to take up the offering now. Thank you. I know we're going over time, but I'm going to pinch a little bit of time anyway, and we'll sing our last hymn, 499, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. We'll close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we know we're called your children, and sometimes we behave like stupid children. But thankfully, as our parent, you are very kind, very patient, and keep on directing us in the right way. Thank you also for the many signs you show that you do care for us and keep us grounded so that we can continue to trust you and hold fast until that time. This I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Because we need help with it to give me the terms.
Well, good morning, Preston Church again. It's now time for the song service, and I'm slowly going through the church hymnal and picking out hymns that are sometimes appropriate, sometimes not appropriate for the season. But the first hymn we're about to have is a very agricultural, what I call an agricultural hymn, and it's one that I have very close to my heart, because even yesterday I was on my tractor mowing down the grass, and it's hymn number 369, Bringing in the Sheaves.
Sowing in the morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the noontide and the dewy eve, waiting for the harvest and the time of reaping, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Sowing in the sunshine, sowing in the shadows, fearing neither clouds nor winter's chilly breeze. By and by the harvest and the labour ended, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves.
Because the beat of the, when you've got, my old Fergie, the music is actually playing at. And I often sing that happily as I'm going. Bass, treble, and all you ladies and men have different parts. Just visiting from Sydney today, and it's very nice to have her on the piano helping Barb as well. So.
Seeking the lost, yet kindly entreating wanderers on the mountain astray. Come unto me, his message repeating, words of the Master speaking today. Going afar, going afar, upon the mountain, bringing the wanderer back again, into the fold of my Redeemer. Jesus the Lamb, for sinners slain, for sinners slain. Seeking the lost and pointing to Jesus, souls that are weak and hearts that are sore, leading them forth in ways of salvation, showing the path to life evermore. Going afar, upon the mountain, bringing the wanderer back again, into the fold of my Redeemer. Jesus the Lamb, for sinners slain, for sinners slain. Thus I will go on missions of mercy, following Christ from day unto day. fold, into the fold of my Redeemer. Jesus the Lamb, Jesus the Lamb, for sinners slain, for sinners slain.
Now, Barbara, I think that was one of your dad's favourites too, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for participating, and the singing was beautiful, folks. So now the church starts properly.
Signs of the times in them that I would like half a dozen or so people to take and distribute in their area, all right? They're on the bench out the back in the foyer. And thirdly, yesterday I had a conversation with Brother Darryl Dryden. Darryl has a tumour behind his nose, and he's aware of that for a long time. And he rang me several times and said, what should I do? Should I get surgery? And knowing Darryl, he has been told that if he has surgery in this area, because of his heart problems, prayer life and keep him before our Maker in prayer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Uncle Bob. Good morning and welcome everyone to Preston Church. My name is Aaron. Preston as well. I haven't been told where Purity. So if you're visiting here for the first time, please feel welcome. Or Uncle Bob.
And it's Val Manatier's birthday in the coming few days.
There you go. Happy birthday in advance. Yeah, so wherever you're sitting, just turn around and see who's sitting next to you. Say hi to them and make them feel welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for that. So our church, as we know, would not be able to function without the faithful few who consistently give their service to ensure that we have music, we have a warm church, and we have beautiful smiles when we walk in. And so just to mention a few, you know yourselves, everybody that makes sure that this church runs, you know yourselves, and we thank you for that. It wouldn't be complete if I did not mention Pastor Vikram, who will be preaching to us today. So thank you for that as well. Now, I'd like to mention that today's Sabbath is going to be a little bit different, and I hope that this will be a blessing to you. I do have a team of some very cheerful helpers who will be assisting me today as we carry on with the program. And so please pay attention to the little ones when they come up front to do a few things here and there. And also, can we find in our hearts to encourage them to, as we, to encourage them to grow up in church and learn to assist at church. And from experience, they do have incredible potential. So, having said that, I would like to invite Jaffe to come and assist. Oh, and your brother as well needs to come as well. Come up front. So the service has begun officially. So his name is Jubilee. My apologies.
Our first hymn today is I Surrender All, and in the Sabbath day against a vintage hymnal. It is song number 309. Please stand as we worship God in song.